Please join me in giving Wyandotte Chief Billy Friend a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here today and to share a little bit about the Wyandotte Nation, our tribal history, and where we were, where we've been, and where we plan on going. And this is actually a first for me. I have an opportunity to speak at a lot of different events across the United States, and had opportunities to speak to different groups. This is my first Pachyderm Club, so I appreciate the offer and appreciate John inviting me to come. I can honestly say, I'll date myself, that my first presidential election I voted for Ronald Reagan, and so it kind of tells you my age going back, but I am a registered Republican. And you know, a lot of times when you think about tribes, and especially most tribes across the United States, they're usually linked to Democrats. And but I think there's a reason behind that. I'll share a little bit with that with you later on that. But I'm honored to be here, and just to share a little bit about who we are and a little bit how I've got here. And I always like to start out because people look at me, and I'm the chief of the Wyandotte Nation. And today we're a nation of over 6,000 tribal citizens. Many of us are scattered across the United States, and one of our goals, as we said, is reconnecting. And but you know, talking about my own personal history and my own journey to where I'm at today, I can honestly say, growing up, when the teacher said, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" I never one time raised my hand and said, "I'm going to be an Indian chief." I didn't say that. I thought I was going to be the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, and I never got over 5'7" and you know, 9/16, and so kind of stopped right there. But anyway, you know, growing up, you know, and where I grew up in northeast Oklahoma, southwest Missouri, of course, we have 9 federally recognized tribes in Ottawa County. Today we have more tribes in one county than any place in the United States. But I like to say that I'm a victim of what we call cultural genocide. You know, a few years ago I was asked to go speak at Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio, about the physical genocide that took place with Native Americans. And it's one of the largest genocides ever recorded in world history, took place right here in the United States. And it's a terrible thing, and you know, to look back and to see what happened. But the cultural genocide that I'm a part of was, I was born in 1963, and growing up, I knew that I was a Wyandotte. I knew I was Indian, but I had no idea what that meant. You know, I didn't know the history. And I was a part of that generation that basically, you know, in the United States, Native Americans are the only people that have to carry a card to tell how much Native American we actually are. This is a CDIB card, which is a certificate degree of Indian blood. And so, you know, we're the only race, you know, that nobody comes up and asks you how much Caucasian you are, how much Italian. You don't have a card that tells you what percentage of that you are. And so growing up, I knew that I was a Native American. I knew I was a Wyandotte tribal citizen. But what did that mean? Because the cultural genocide that took place was that by the time that my grandmother or my grandfather, when they was in Oklahoma, they were taking children out of homes and sending them to boarding schools. They were forced to go to boarding schools. These Indian boarding schools had a mantra that hung over their door that said, that kill the Indian, save the man. And kids were forced into these schools. In fact, the Wyandotte Nation, where we sit today, was the home of one of the largest boarding schools in Oklahoma. It was called the Seneca Indian School. And so many people that I talk to that are elders today, they went to that school. And they were forced, number one, to cut their hair. They were put in military uniforms. And they could not speak their language. They could not practice their traditions. Many of them would run away and go back home. And so those that would run away, what did they do with them? They began, instead of sending them to Seneca Indian Boarding School, they would send them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or they would send them to Chilocco, or they would send them to a farther place where they could not go back home. And so guess what happens by the time my mom arrives in 1943? What does her parents tell her? Don't tell anybody that you're Indian. And so all of a sudden, we grow up, in my generation, we have a generation that doesn't know who we are. That identity has basically been stolen from us. And so when I came to work for the tribe in 1998, I thought I was going to be there for a short time and I was going to move on. We built a new healthcare and wellness center and to provide healthcare services to our people. I got a job there, and at that time we had a chief by the name of Leiford Bearskin. And Chief Bearskin was a World War II B-24 bomber pilot, flew 46 missions in World War II, and he had a dream and a vision to rebuild and to reestablish the Wyandotte Nation. And I began to talk to Chief, and I began to get a passion to know our history and to know who we are and where we came from. And I began to set out, and today our goal, the goal that we have among the Wyandotte people, is that we never have another generation of Wyandotte children that do not have the opportunity to learn their history and to learn their culture, their traditions, and their language. And that's what we're doing today. And so my own personal journey, I began to want to find out, well, where did my family come from? Because when I stand before a group like you today, 90% of you are looking at me and you're saying, he doesn't look Indian. He's got blue eyes. Why is that? And so I began to research and begin to look back. And my family history goes back into 1743 in Greenbrier, Virginia. There was a young boy born into this world by the name of Adam Brown. Adam Brown had a brother named Samuel Brown. In approximately 1751, 1752, somewhere in there, Adam Brown was anywhere from 8 to 10 years old. The Wyandottes attacked their village, and they attacked the schoolhouse that day. And they captured Adam Brown and his brother, Samuel. And at that time, if you remember, one of the practices was if the natives, if they lost a son in battle, then they would take another son to replace him. Adam Brown, his brother Samuel, escaped and went back in a few days, but Adam Brown was taken back to Michigan, where the Wyandottes were at that time. And he was adopted into the Deer clan of the tribe, which is very important because at that time only the principal chief could come out of the Deer clan. Adam Brown grew up. He married a Wyandotte woman. She was 3/4 Wyandotte and a quarter French. And they began to have children. But Adam Brown eventually became the village chief. He became the chief. He was Chief Brown. He signed 3 of our treaties with the federal government. Adam Brown became basically the archivist for the tribe, or the historian. In his cabin in Brownstown, Michigan, if you go to Detroit today and just south of Detroit, you'll come into Brownstown. It's still a city there today named after Adam Brown. In Adam Brown's cabin, he had a large trunk, and that was where all the treaties were kept. That was where all the wampum belts were kept, because at that time, anytime that there was basically a treaty or an agreement made between two tribes, between two woodlands tribes, there was a wampum belt exchanged, and it was a belt with beads that told a story. And the story goes that every fall that Adam Brown would bring those young warriors, Wyandotte warriors, into his cabin, and he would begin to lay out all the wampum and begin to lay out all the documents, and he would begin to teach them what each wampum meant and what agreements that they had made with different tribes. He became basically the historian and the archivist at that time. Well, as Native people, we are taught to look 7 years ahead and to look 7 years behind. And when I began to look back to Adam Brown, I found out that Adam Brown had a son by the name of Samuel Brown, who had a son by the name of John D. Brown, who named his son John D., who had a son by the name of Alpheus, who had a son by the name of Calvin, who had a daughter by the name of Beverly, who's my mother. I'm 7 generations removed from Adam Brown. And so looking back and seeing what Adam Brown, the importance that he placed on knowing the history and knowing the agreements and teaching that, has now 7 generations become important once again to us. And so that's a little bit of the history about myself, a little bit of history about the tribe, and talking about the Wyandotte Nation. We were actually a part, many of you have heard of the Hurons, and the Wyandottes were actually a part of the Huron Confederacy. So in the early the Wyandottes first had contact with French Jesuit priests in 1535. And at that time, you can see where it says Wyandotte. We were a part of the Huron Confederacy. And the Huron Confederacy was basically made up of 5 different tribes. And in 1535, there was approximately 100,000 in the Huron Confederacy. In 1649, what took place at that time, there was a war that broke out between the Wyandotte and the Iroquois Confederacy. And it was over beaver furs. It was called the Beaver Wars in 1649 and 1650. And basically, the Iroquois defeated the Huron Confederacy, and the Wyandotte, the Huron Confederacy was dispersed all across Canada. In fact, we call it the dispersal period. And basically, they chased us. The Iroquois chased us and tried to annihilate us, chased us as far as Niagara Falls. And so eventually the Wyandottes, or two of the tribes that belonged to the Huron Confederacy, would come back eventually and reestablish themselves. But the traditional lands of the Wyandotte, you can see, were immense. They extended from Montreal, Canada, along the Georgian Bay, eventually to what we called Caratian, or Detroit River region, as we know it today, to the Ohio River. And this was just prior to the Iroquois Wars. And that's where we first started. And with the arrival of the European diseases eventually, and after the 1650s, basically the Huron Confederacy was shrunk down. We had lost almost all of our people. Many of them had died from disease. Many of them had died from warfare. But eventually in the early 1700s, when the Great Peace Accord in Montreal was signed in 1701, once again, there was a major shift in tribal villages. At that time also, there was a French explorer by the name of Antoine de Cadillac who came to Detroit, and he wanted to establish a fort and a trading post in what is today Detroit. And so he invited several tribes, the Anishinaabe, the Odaways, and several others, the Ottawas, all came and once again settled in that area. The Potawatomi as well, which you have Potawatomi in Kansas today. You have the Prairie Band Potawatomi. But the Wyandottes were always considered the eldest nation, and many Wyandotte and the Anishinaabe were fluent in 4 languages and numerous dialects of those languages, which is very important for the trade industry at that time, to be able to trade and to deal with other tribes and other nations. This was the Native American settlements in Detroit at that time. You can see the first Wyandotte settlement right here, which is basically where Brownstown is today. And then eventually also we established across the river on the Canadian side as well. Of course, then after the Revolutionary War in 1787, the American government issued the Northwest Ordinance, stating that the utmost faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. In their property rights and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed. But white settlers continued to push westward. And what happened at that time, I was talking to someone early this morning. There's a very good book out today by David McCullough, who's a great historian, called The Pioneers. And it talks about what happened after the Revolutionary War. The U.S. had incurred all of this debt. They had no way to pay debt back. And so what did they do? They gave these soldiers that they owed money to, they gave them land grants. And those land grants, of course, it was in Ohio, and it was where natives were settled there. In fact, in Ohio, there was one time 54 tribes that called Ohio home. And so all of a sudden you have this western expansion coming across, and they begin to push in to native land. And so in 1790, you had a large war. It was actually called General Josiah Harmer was sent by General Washington, or President Washington, to go in and to put down the Indian skirmish there. Of course, the Indians had conformed a confederacy of tribes led by Tecumseh, a Shawnee warrior, which John Todd is Shawnee back here. And but Tecumseh had put together a confederacy. They annihilated General Harmer's army. And so President Washington sends Arthur St. Clair, another American general from the Revolutionary War, in 1791, once again to confront the tribal confederacy. And Arthur St. Clair, it was probably the most devastating defeat the United States has ever taken in a war. It's called the Battle of the Wabash, if you ever look it up. And so once again, the Americans were pushed back by this Indian Confederacy. And so General Washington, or President Washington, he enlists the services of Anthony Wayne. If you've heard of Mad Anthony Wayne, or Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so Mad Anthony Wayne, he trained a legion of soldiers, which is 4,000. And he trained them for 2 years. They began to make their way toward Ohio, and in 1794 they met up at what was called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, right outside of Toledo, Ohio. It's in Maumee. If you go there today, they've preserved the battlefield. It's a great place to go and learn history. And but it was there that General Wayne defeated the Indian Confederacy. The tribes were dispersed. The Wyandottes, we lost every chief in that battle except for one. Chief Tarhay survived the battle, went back to Upper Sandusky, and so in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville was signed. And the Treaty of Greenville was the first of the largest treaty probably to be signed. Chief Tarhay was the first to sign. The Wyandotte chief was the first to speak. He was the first to sign that treaty. This treaty would split the Wyandotte tribe, because you still had the Wyandottes who were in Michigan, who were still loyal to Tecumseh and the British, and they were called the Huron Party of the Wyandotte. And then you had the Citizen Party, or the neutral party, that was led by Tarhay, who stayed in Ohio, because leading up to this would be the Battle of 1812. And so, but during this time, you can see the treaties. We signed the treaty in 1795, which led to the treaty in 1803, which led to the treaty of 1805, which led to the treaty of 1807, and then the treaty of 1808. And guess what? The Wyandotte agreed to cede lands to the government. So what's the deal with all these treaties have in common? We went from 5 million acres of land to 109,000 acres of land in this amount of treaties, which ties into our land in Park City, which I'll get to maybe in the question and answer. The Treaty of 1817, which would give us the 109,000 acres of fertile land that overlooked the Sandusky River in Ohio. We were promised this reserved land would be ours for permanently, for generations to come. We settled in what is now Upper Sandusky in Ohio. We became acculturated. I don't like to say assimilated, but the Wyandottes became very acculturated, and what that means is that they took on enough of the white custom and the European American customs that they thought would allow them to get a stay there. And they did. We were the very last tribe to leave Ohio. Andrew Jackson would come along and pass the Indian Removal Act in 1830. And the interesting thing about the Indian Removal Act in 1830, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, what? They said it was not constitutional. And Andrew Jackson says, we're doing it anyway. And so, which was the Indian Removal Act. And so many of the tribes, of course, were forced to move before that. We did not. We finally signed a treaty in 1842, but we had stayed there until then. But why we were in Ohio, the very first Methodist missionary that the Methodists ever had was a man by the name of John Stewart, who was a black man, who came and began to preach to the Wyandottes in the year of about 1816. And he established the very first Methodist mission in Upper Sandusky, Ohio, that is still there today. And last year, 2 years ago, I had a call from the United Methodist Global Missions, and they wanted to meet with me in Ohio, and I went and met with them. And they said, we want to give this land back to you. We want to give the church, the mission, and the 3 acres that go with it. And I can say for Indians, nobody ever calls us and says, we want to give something back. And so very excited. We went out last fall. We had a great celebration. We met with the Methodists. We transferred the deed, and it was really a great time. But that was really one of the things that helped the Wyandotte people, because the Methodists established not only a church but a school. And so by the time we left there, We had 2 of our chiefs who became ordained Methodist ministers. We had 2 of our tribal citizens who had passed the bar, who became attorneys while they were there. The postmaster general, the postmaster of Upper Sandusky, was a Wyandotte citizen, so that education would become very beneficial to us by the time we left Ohio. So, and we boarded 2 steamboats July 19th in 1843 in Cincinnati, Ohio. And there we see, and we were promised 148,000 acres of land in Kansas. And so that was the reason that finally that we left, because the U.S. had promised us 148,000 acres of land in what is today Wyandotte County, Kansas. And so we boarded the steamships. We took the trip, the 800-mile trip. There were 664 Wyandottes that made that journey at that time. They arrived on the muddy banks of the Missouri and the Kansas River at what we call Caw Point today. And when they woke up, they basically were forced off the steamboats in the middle of the night. They even forced us off on the wrong side. They forced us off on the Missouri side. We had to get back across to the Kansas side, only to realize that the land that was promised us had already been given away. So we have 664 people living on the muddy banks of the Mississippi for that winter. We lost 100 citizens that first year. And the Delawares were kind enough to give us a burial ground to bury our people. This is Caw Point today. If you go up, there's really a great monument there at Caw Point in Kansas City, Kansas. And so the Huron Indian Cemetery is downtown Kansas City, Kansas today in Wyandotte County. It's a National Historic Landmark. This was the land that the Delawares had gave us to bury our dead. And eventually we would sit down in December. We would work with the Delawares, and we purchased 36 tracts of land from them. And as a gift, because we had given them land in Ohio, they gave us 3 more tracts of land. So we had about 25,000 acres in what is Kansas City, Kansas today, right on the confluence of the Caw or the Kansas and the Missouri River. Once again, the tribes, we met there because at that time, of course, the Shawnees were there, the Delawares and other tribes. Once again, the Wyandottes, we had a convention, and the other tribes once again appointed us to be the head and made us the keepers of the council fire. And so some of the historical facts during our stay in Kansas, of course, Kansas City at that time was called Wyandotte City before it was Kansas City. I had a tribal citizen reach out to me this week from Washington. She sent me a picture that she took off her TV, and one of the questions on Jeopardy last week, they asked the lady on Jeopardy, what was Kansas City, Kansas known as before it was Kansas City, Kansas? The lady didn't get the question right, but it was Wyandotte City. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and that comes up, you know the answer. I'll just want 10% of the earnings, so if you win. The present in 1853, when they formed the Nebraska Territory, which of course was Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, parts of Wyoming, the very first territorial governor of the Nebraska Territory was a Wyandotte citizen. It was William Walker Jr., who was a Wyandotte, who was elected as the first governor. The present Constitution of the state of Kansas is called the Wyandotte Constitution. Anybody know that? Because they had tried 3 other times to get a constitution for the state of Kansas. The 4th time they met in Wyandotte City, and there, with the assistance of the Wyandottes, they came up with the constitution that Kansas has today, the Wyandotte Constitution. Of course, it was the 4th constitution voted on by the people between the battle of pro-slavery and anti-slavery. The Wyandottes, the majority, were anti-slavery because they were anti-slavery when they were in Ohio. But for some reason, when they came to Kansas City, they built 2 Methodist churches on the corners downtown Kansas City. They had 2 Methodist churches diagonally from one another. One of them was pro-slavery, one was anti-slavery. They ended up burning each other's churches down. Fortunately, my family, they were anti-slavery, and they formed the town of Quindaro. So have you ever heard of the town Quindaro? Quindaro is a part of Kansas City, Kansas. Quindaro was named after one of my relatives. Her name was Nancy Quindaro Brown Guthrie. She married a man by the name of Abelard Guthrie. And so Quindaro is a Wyandotte word that means a bundle of sticks, which is interpreted meaning there's strength and unity. And so one of the largest underground railroads in the United States was at Quindaro. And it's right on the river there, and they would bring the slaves from Parkville, Missouri. They would bring them across at night, cover them with corn husk, and bring them across and set them free in Quindaro. And so it's still there today. There's Quindaro Overlook and Quindaro Ruins in Kansas City, Kansas. This is what it looked like at that time in Kansas City. You can see the Shawnee Reserve, the Delaware. This was the Wyandotte Purchase here. And so in 1855, the government comes in once again. They decide that they want the land because guess what? This 25,000 acres is one of the best places there because it's on the confluences of the two rivers. It's where they want to bring the railroad across. And so what do? In the Treaty of 1855? They terminate our tribal status. They come in and say, you're not a tribe anymore, but you can become American citizens. And so for many of our tribal citizens at that time, they were very entrepreneurial. In fact, 2 of the ferry boats were ran by Wyandottes, so back and forth across the river. And as I said, many of them had become educated. And so during that time, those who wanted to become U.S. citizens, because you have to remember, Indians could not vote, Indians could not own land. And so for many of the Wyandottes, they accepted U.S. citizenship. So once again, our tribe is split. We have the Citizen Party and we have the Indian Party. Those who wanted to remain Indian, many of them went to Oklahoma with their Shawnee and their Seneca brethren and joined up with them down there. But the Civil War was going on and they were harassed by Confederate soldiers and Confederate Army. And so they came back to Kansas, and eventually we signed our final treaty in 1867, which allowed us to purchase 20,000 acres of land where we're at today in Oklahoma. And in 1867, we made our final journey with less than 300 citizens to Oklahoma. This was the Wyandotte Reservation in the Treaty of 1855. And of course, that's another map. You can see Quindaro, which we talked about here on the Missouri River. This is the Wyandotte land. This is Shawnee, Delaware, and probably Prairie Band here. And of course, as I said, in 1867, we sent a delegation to Washington, D.C. to sign our final treaty. This was Matthew Mudeater. Matthew Mudeater was the chief that led our tribe to Oklahoma and was the chief when we arrived in Oklahoma in 1867. Very interesting thing here. I'll get over here where I can point this out. And so this is tribal jurisdictions in Oklahoma today. And so we have 38 tribes in Oklahoma, 39 counting one of our tribal creek tribal towns. And so you can see Wyandotte over in this corner. And so we've got 9 tribes here in this very corner. Now, here's the Choctaw. Look at all the counties they have. This is the Chickasaw, right on I-35. Of course, the Cherokees, all of this land. And then you've got 9 little bitty tribes trying to survive up here. And the reason that is difficult when it comes to economic development, that's where we have, if we want to take advantages of what we call tribal trust land, and we want to take advantages of taxation, because how many knows the only way that the government can create revenue is through taxes. The government can't produce revenue otherwise. And so, these tribes here have the ability to build businesses and put sales tax in different ways. And so it's become a challenge for smaller tribes. This is today, this is the Wyandotte, this is what we purchased from the Seneca Cayuga. This was 20,000 acres that eventually was allotted out. And today, where you see the yellow and the red, that's land that we've had to go back and purchase. And that's land that we own today. We do not own the 20,000 acres any longer. And so this is land that we've had to purchase through real estate development. Any man who thinks he can be happy and prosperous by letting the government take care of him, better take a look at the American Indian. Because, one of the things that that takes place on reservations is, and in Oklahoma we do not have reservations, but it creates that dependency on government programs. We don't need more government. We need opportunity. We don't need more government assistance. We need just the opportunities to govern ourselves. And so one of the things that I always like to go to Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon was actually the first person to actually get it right. And one of the things that he said here down at the bottom, the time has come to break decisively with the past, create the conditions for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. Indians always governed themselves. We always had a form of self-governance. Wherever we were in the 1700s, 1600s, as far as we go back, we always were able to govern ourselves and provide for our own people. And so Richard Nixon, he for some reason had an affinity toward Native American and Native people, and he said, let's give the tribes the opportunity to, we have failed miserably for years. The government failed tribes. They failed at solving those problems. You can't just throw money at problems and take care of them. Give Indians the opportunities and let their future be determined by the things that they do, not by the things that we do. The Indian Self-Determination Act, what this did, provided the government agencies to enter into contracts with, make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. And so today, the Wyandottes, we are a self-governance tribe. What does that mean? Used to, at one time, all the government funds, like for our health care, they went to Indian Health Service, and the government built a clinic or the government built a hospital, and all Indians had to go there, much like the VA. I always say, if you want to see how good the government is at taking care of people healthcare wise, when people talk about, I'm getting political here, but if you talk about government health care, go to an Indian hospital or go to a VA and you'll find out how well they do it at taking care of people. Tribes have the highest incidence of infant mortality, the highest rates of across the board, heart disease, all of these things. And so now, instead of that money going to a government institution, that money comes to the Wyandottes. We build our own clinic, we hire our own doctors, we hire our own physicians, our own nurse practitioners, and we take care of our own people. And it takes economic development money to do that, because we only receive about a third of what it takes to run our clinic. We have to produce the rest economically. IGRA, this is another thing. People say, well, why do tribes have casinos? Why do tribes have casinos and nobody else can have casinos? Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is what IGRA stands for. Sets forth an economic rationale for Indian gaming on reservation. The major purpose of the act to provide statutory foundation for gambling operations as a means of promoting economic development, self-sufficiency, and strong tribal government. And so when we talk about Indian gaming, all of those dollars flow right back into our programs. I had the opportunity to speak at Park City Chamber of Commerce and showed them what we do today. That money goes right back into providing $1 million for scholarships for our youth. It provides housing for our elders. That money provides a preschool for us to have 120 kids a day in our preschool. And on, but the money that's generated, and so that was the reason that this was passed. That was the reason they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, is it so that we could take that money and we could work towards self-sufficiency. And the Wyandottes, we do more than just gaming. We do a lot of federal contracting and other businesses as well. But that's where a lot of the income comes from, and that's the reason why. At this time, I'll take any questions and answers.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Our members first.
Thank you for coming to the Pachyderm Club. I recently read a book by Bill O'Reilly called Killing Crazy Horse. It has a tremendous amount of Indian history in it. I wonder if you had read the book and if you had a comment on it.
I have not had a chance to read it, but I picked it up at Sam's last week, and I haven't had a chance to open it yet, but I do have it, yes.
Yeah, when you get your casino going in Park City, can you explain to me what taxes you're going to pay? Are you going to pay federal income tax, sales tax, property tax, state income tax? Give me all the list of taxes that you're going to be required to pay.
0. Except for tribal tax. The 10.5 acres that so we have 10.5 acres where the gaming has to take place. Now, in Kansas City, Kansas, where we have a casino, the 7th Street Casino, we sat down and negotiated an MOU with the city of Kansas City, Kansas. And we pay them, in lieu of taxes, we pay them a certain amount every year. It's like $500,000 that they get. And that's a very small casino in downtown Kansas City, Kansas. It's an old Masonic lodge, just 3 stories with 500 games in it. And so, but yeah, that's the 10.5 acres. Now, we own 109 acres there. And so any development that takes place on the 100 acres plus, then that'll be subject to state, federal taxes, whatever anybody else would pay.
Okay, next question over here.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say great presentation. I enjoyed that. So going back to your health care, when your employees, do you withhold from them for like Social Security, not Social Security, but like Medicare? And then when members of your tribe turn 65, do they go on Social, or do they go on Medicare, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, and so, you know, as I said, we have 6,675 tribal citizens today. We have approximately 1,500 that live in the state of Oklahoma, and we have approximately about 1,000 who live in our service area. So most of our employees are not tribal citizens. But even those that are tribal citizens, no, they have all the withholdings out of their check. Now, the only difference is if they are a tribal citizen and they live in tribal housing on tribal trust land, then we do not withhold state income tax out of their checks.
Well, I was more specific talking about the Medicare portion of it, and then once they hit 65, do they go on Medicare, or do you continue to take care of them?
No, they go on. They do go on Medicare, and then Indian Health Services, where our funding comes from, the Health and Human Services for our clinic, and so they're always the payer of last resort. And so if a person comes in and have Medicare, we bill Medicare, and then whatever is left, then we pay. Okay. Yeah, that is paid with the funding, yes.
Okay, next question over here.
Chief, would you explain how you wound up with 10 acres in Park City, Kansas? There's some interesting background on that. And is that land, it's federally recognized land, is it technically part of the state of Kansas?
Okay. So when we looked at the treaties when I pointed out earlier that where we gave up over 5 million acres of land, that in those treaties there was language in there that we were to be compensated for that land at an annuity rate each year. And so I think it was 1956, the tribe filed a claim in Indian Lands Claim Court, and that drug on from this is how efficient sometimes the government can be, from 1956 to 1984. And then Congress passed a law in 1984 called Public Law 98602. And in that public law that was passed by Congress, they reimbursed the tribe at I think $1.25 an acre for all that land that we gave up there. And so the tribe received, and in that law it said that the majority of that money would be distributed in per capita payments to the tribal citizens at that time that were 18 and over. Those who were 18 and younger, that was put into a trust account, and when those kids would turn 18, they would receive that amount of money. And so, but also in that, it said that the Wyandotte shall set aside $100,000 to purchase property, purchase real estate, and the Secretary of Interior shall take it into trust. And so that word shall, we're probably the last tribe to ever get the word shall put in a bill, because that became what we call a mandatory acquisition. And so in 1992, the tribe purchased the 10.5 acres in Park City with the intent of putting a casino there. we have to go through what we call an application. You have to submit a land into trust application that goes to the Department of Interior, and they take the land into trust. Well, at that time, it went, and there was a deputy solicitor in the Interior Office that issued an opinion back to the tribe that says this land does not qualify under Indian Gaming Regulatory Act for gaming. And so the tribe, instead of, because there's two exceptions under IGRA, there's two exceptions where you can game off reservation. One of them has to be within your historic reservation boundaries. Well, this is not within, we knew that Wichita was not, or Park City was not within our historic reservation boundaries. But the second exception is it has to be a part of the land claim settlement, which we thought we could win that argument. But instead of doing that, we went to Kansas City, we purchased what was called the Shriners Tract. We litigated that for 12 years. The Shriners Tract is right next to the Huron Cemetery. And so we thought, okay, it's within the reservation boundaries, we'll win that argument. We get defeated at the 10th Circuit. We applied for it to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it, so the 10th Circuit opinion stood. And so then we went back and re-argued the land claim settlement, and we won that. And we opened that casino in 2008. So at that time, with 12 years of legal precedent that has been set, we said we'll go back because that only proves that Park City was purchased with land claim settlement money. And you know, that all the legal, because the argument had always been, well, you did not have enough money to buy Kansas City because you purchased Park City. And it was an argue over if there was enough money in the account or not. And so that's how we got to where we're at today. So in May the 20th of this year, Jeanette Hanna, the director of the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, took the land into trust for the purposes of gaming. And then we had to go to the National Indian Gaming Commission, apply for a gaming license, and they issued that license about a month later. And so that's all we need. That's all we need to game there. And you know, Kansas has filed suit against the United States. They've not filed suit against the Wyandottes. Their suit is against the Secretary of Interior, and that's at the district court level today. But that 10.5 acres it's federal. It's held in trust by the federal government for the purpose of the Wyandotte Nation.
Chief, I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question, and maybe a little unfair because it's a fairly lengthy one. Since you all have some land down in Oklahoma, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case last year that questioned a lot of the land titles and tied into tribal land. I appreciate your comments in terms of how that would affect the Wyandotte tribe at all, and be limited land there, and also point out if you have any comments about the fact that the only national American Indian who's gotten into national office was Charles Curtis, who is vice president under Herbert Hoover, and I don't know what role he may have had. I think he was a Potawatomi, but I may be wrong on that point. You can clarify it, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
He was a Kaw. He was a member of the Kaw Nation, and he was the first vice president of color, not Kamala Harris, so just get that straight. And so anyway, Charles Curtis was actually instrumental in saving the Huron Cemetery as well, because the Kansas City, Kansas was going to reinterm. They were going to dig up all the bodies and reinterm them somewhere else because where the cemetery sits, and Charles Curtis got involved in that. Are you talking about the McGirt case with the Creek Nation?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what happened was, anyways, a criminal case that took place in what used to be the Creek Reservation. It went to the 10th Circuit. The 10th Circuit ruled that the Creek Reservation never had been disestablished. And so, that gentleman, even though he was guilty of the crime, he could not be tried in a state court, would have to be tried in a federal court or a tribal court. And so that has opened Pandora's box currently in Oklahoma, because now all the tribes can argue that none of our reservations were ever disestablished. And in the 10th Circuit, the first 10th Circuit case was called the Murphy case. And what happened in the Murphy case, Neil Gorsuch was still at the 10th Circuit, and it was a unanimous decision that came out of there. And but when it got to the Supreme Court, because Neil Gorsuch was there, they had to go back and retry a different case because Gorsuch had to recuse himself, and it went 4-4. There was no deciding vote on that. But basically, it's a criminal case, and so what could happen is that any crime that takes place in, like on the Wyandotte, what used to be our reservation, if they're Native American, it would have to be tried in the Native American court. It would have to be tried in our court and not the county court. And so a lot of tribes are not prepared for that. Tribes that have the large jurisdictional areas, I mean, if you've got 14 counties and you have a Native American that commits a murder, and they want to be tried in the tribal court, a lot of tribes don't have the capacity to do that. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Chief Billy Friend, Wyandotte Nation.